It is a real honor to be back. It's been a while. In case you didn't know, I started here as an assistant pastor in 1988. That's a long time ago. I looked a lot different back then. By the way, shalom. Shalom. Shalom aleichem. That's pretty good Auburn language. Aleichem. Shalom aleichem. Peace be unto you. I don't know if you noticed, but the greeting is a blessing. It's not just a hi, how are you, howdy, how you doing? It's a blessing, and only God can give you that, and that's what we want to give you tonight. So, hey, tonight is not a Passover Seder. If you came thinking it was going to be, you're going to be really blessed. But it's not a Seder, not because I don't like doing them. We just don't have time. But what happens here tonight happened during the Last Supper. All I want is for you to undo 2,000 years of corrective thinking about what happened back then, because they experienced a very different time when they gathered on that evening. I want to get you into their heads, the heads of the disciples, as they heard Jesus at the Last Supper. Now, we'll start with this. The Last Supper was a Passover. It was definitely a Passover. There's a lot of questions and controversy about that today, but it's only because they really don't understand what you're hearing tonight. That's the really important part. But when I say the Last Supper, this comes to mind, doesn't it? Most of you in this room, perhaps even all of you, it's a fairly safe statement, is to say that you probably have some rendering of this in your house. It might be in a book, it might be on a desktop, it might be even on a picture or a plaque somewhere in your room, or maybe in a Bible somewhere. Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, I love it, on the dining hall wall in the chapel of Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan, Italy. It's quite possibly the greatest masterpiece ever painted in the Western world. An amazing thing. Leonardo was a genius on every level, including he was a tremendous artist. But I can tell you one thing you need to understand. He was not a theologian. This thing is horribly wrong. I mean, it's beautiful, but it's horribly wrong. I was an art major in college for a long time. I had to study this thing. Let me tell you what the problem is here, and you can help me out with this. The Passover, according to the Bible, a Passover ceremony. It was also, at the time of Jesus, never called a Seder. It was a celebration. So there was a whole other mood to it back then. But at a Passover celebration, according to the Bible, what time of day was the Passover supposed to take place? Evening, right? Sunset or later. Look behind Jesus' head. Nice, bright blue afternoon sky. Strike one. Secondly, Jesus is the host of the feast. He's right in the middle of this long elevated table, and all the disciples are sitting, if you look very, very carefully, on elevated stools. That was only for kings and queens in those days. Peasants, which these guys were, never sat at an elevated table ever. And what about that long white tablecloth? Where do you get one of those? At the White Jerusalem tablecloth store? It's not going to happen. There's some things that you really can't see. The picture's a little out of focus, but it's all right. Underneath the table, Leonardo painted the disciples' feet. The problem is they're all wearing their sandals. You never wear your sandals or shoes into a house in the Middle East, ever. From back then even to this day. You just don't do it. Very bad manners. He didn't know that. And on the table, there are supposed to be elements of the Passover up there, many of which you guys know, some of which were, well, let's see, the most important item on the table. There were two of them. One was lamb. There was supposed to be roasted lamb on the table. If you happen to look very carefully at the plate in front of Jesus, he has a plate of eels. Fish. Very unkosher fish, eels. And, of course, you're supposed to have unleavened bread on the table, which you had something like that tonight. This still has leaven in it, but it's very, very thin bread. And it was supposed to be up there. It's like a crepe. I don't think Leonardo liked unleavened bread because he painted Italian dinner rolls all over the table. It's a tremendous painting. It's terrible theology. The Jews in Jesus' day never ate the way that we eat today. In fact, across the Middle East regionally, people just didn't do it. The Romans might, the Jews, the Arabs before 600 years before they were Muslims, they also used to eat on the floor. They'd just get down, they'd sit around a cook pot, something like this, usually made out of clay. Women did all the cooking. Guys were down at the coffee shop drinking coffee and talking about politics. Not much has changed in a couple of thousand years. And they would come home, the cook pot would be over a little charcoal fire, and they would reach in with a piece of bread, using it almost like tongs, grab the food and eat it that way. And they only ate with their right hands because their left hand was used, even if it was washed, for toilet duties. Remember, toilet paper was only invented 150 years ago. You might have washed that hand, but we all know where it's been. You only ate with your right hand. By the way, that's half the world today. I'm not trying to disgust you. It just happens to be the facts. So this is the way they would eat. And the family would gather around and they would enjoy the meal, whatever they could get of it. But you know, they were so poor, especially in the Galilee, that approximately 80 to 85% of the best estimates that the peasants in the Galilee region only ate one meal every 2 days. And man, it wasn't much. It was usually a pasty grain. They didn't kill their animals for meat. They couldn't. They needed the animals to give them milk, to give them eggs, to give them wool, to give them labor. They didn't kill the animals. So it was lots of grains, beans, lentils, maybe fish. They could get that. It'd be dry. They'd put it in there, but they'd make up whatever they could, and they ate only like every other day. Is it any wonder that when you have the great miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000, that at the end of every one of those miracles in the record of the Bible, it says that they all ate and were full, because it may have been the first time in their lives they ever were. It's a very important detail. Well, this is the way the Jews used to eat. But in the days of Jesus, the rabbis of those days had imposed a lot of traditions on the people, a lot of customs that they were to keep, and one of them was that once a year, every Jew, man, woman, and child, was to eat one meal like a rich person. And that meal was the Passover. The Passover was meant to express not only freedom from Egypt, even though when you read the Bible, even in Exodus, it never talks about freedom. It talks about getting away and out from under oppression, out from under slavery. And that's what the Romans were doing to the people. And so, as a protest, the rabbis wanted to remind the people that they were free, that they were under God. And even though there was the oppression of man, the oppression of an empire, that they followed God and He was bigger than them. That's us today, by the way. If you don't remember that part, remember it. So they were to eat one meal like the rich, and it was the Passover. And without going into a lot of detail tonight, because I could go on for about 4 hours, and I ain't going to do that to you, this table, the shape that you have here, this is a rich man's table. It's not that. This is the rich man's table. This table has a name. You find these all over the Roman Empire, where the Greeks were, even where the Jews were. You can even occasionally find these tables in synagogues. I was in Miletus at this time last year. There's a whole Roman gymnasium packed full of these tables called tricliniums. Three-sided, clinium, reclining table. It describes why this was a rich man's table. This U-shaped table, it was only for the wealthy. Why? Because you'll notice everybody's on the outside of the table. Nobody sat on the inside, because this is for your servants if you were a Jew, or slaves if you were a Roman, because they would come through a door that was here opposite the U and the table. That was for security reasons. I'll get to that in a second. But the door was here. They would come through the door and they would put food on the table, and they would make sure that you were well taken care of here. So this was made for servants or slaves. If you had servants or slaves, you were? You were? Thank you very much. You're rich. That was it. It's a rich man's table. And this is what they were to do at Passover. This is what the disciples and Jesus sat around at Passover. But wait, they didn't just sit at the table. Looking around the table here are all our wonderful disciples and volunteers. Thank you so much. And they're all sitting the way you would probably sit today. But they're sitting wrong. Show them how it's done, everyone. Try three-sided. Clinium, reclining table. They are reclining at the table. They're leaning on their left arm because they're not supposed to touch food with their left hand. Their body's in this zigzag shape out behind them. They eat with their right hand. They're perpendicular to the table. They have to twist their bodies like this. The table is approximately the right height for any triclinium table of that day. Very, very low to the floor. This is how you ate. And there would be cushions or pads around the table, perhaps mats made out of palm fronds if you were very, very poor. If you were really poor, you had to come up with one of these because the rabbis made sure that you did that. They might even inspect. This is the way you've got to eat because you have to celebrate. I don't know. That's what they kind of did. But anyway, this is the reclining position. Rich people would eat this way because it was considered very, very elegant. And of course, they're reclining at the table. They're resting. And at any given feast, not just a Passover, they would do this. They would do this at wedding feasts. And if they were reclining at the table, they would sing songs, play games, tell stories, catch up on the news, whatever it was that they could do. Quote scripture, pray, just talk and feast and eat. At a wedding feast for 7 days and nights at the table, you slept at the table. You have cushions, you have pads, it's comfortable, and the food's right there. You would just spend the night at the table for 7 days and nights. If it was a coming-of-age feast, like a bar mitzvah kind of a thing, it could be like that for 2 solid weeks. I mean, if you were poor and you were invited to a feast, you'd never miss it. Now, I got to tell you something about this table. The disciples had an ongoing argument. You're students of the Bible. What was it? What was it? Who was the greatest? Yeah, and you can imagine these guys arguing back and forth. I'm the greatest, I'm the greatest. No, you're not. Jesus likes me best, or whatever it might be. You could picture Jesus. He's ministering to people. He's packed all the time. People just crowded around him, wanting him to touch them or bless their kids or whatever it might be. And suddenly Jesus feels a finger digging into his shoulder, and some guy says, "Excuse me, Master, are those guys with you?" And he turns around. I'm the greatest, I'm the greatest, I'm the greatest. Oy vey, how long am I going to have to be with you? It was miserable hearing them do that, but the disciples did it for a reason. They knew a passage of Scripture that chances are somebody in this room just read it today, but you may not have memorized it. Isaiah chapter 25. Isaiah 25 only has 12 verses in it, but it was very important to a group of people like this who were expecting Jesus to become the Messiah, and they wanted to rule and reign with him. I'm the greatest. In Isaiah 25, it talks about when the Messiah comes to take over his kingdom, he's going to initiate his earthly kingdom with a great feast. And whoever sat at his right hand and his left hand at that feast, they were the greatest. That's the basis of their argument. I'm the greatest, I'm the greatest, I'm the greatest. It was all about dinner reservations. That's what their argument was at the Messiah's feast when he came into his kingdom. Now, Jesus took them down a notch with a parable. I'm going to tell you the parable, and then we're going to jump into the content of the evening. The parable was simply this. He's hearing them argue back and forth. I'm the greatest, no, you're not, so forth. And he turns to the guys and he says, listen to me. Whenever you're invited to a wedding feast would be around a triclinium table, a great table, a rich man's table. Whenever you're invited to a wedding feast, Jesus told his disciples, do not sit down at the best seats. What are those? Here's what the disciples were arguing about. At any triclinium, there's a pecking order. The table isn't everybody come in and sit where you want. They would argue and fight about where they could sit because this wing of the table, entering the U to the left wing right here, these are the VIP seats. If you're great, you're going to sit here. That's the way it works. You say, wait a minute, that's back here. Nope, that's Da Vinci. Da Vinci was wrong. These seats here, you may be great and you may not be great. But these seats over here, scum of the earth. Nobody ever wanted to sit over here. These were horrible seats over here. And that's the way their table ethics worked. Jesus said, whenever you're invited to a wedding feast, talking to his disciples, he says, don't sit down at the best seats, lest the host who invited you come with someone more worthy and say to you, friend, what are you doing there? Give place to this man. And with shame, you get up from the table and you take your place at the lowest seats. Instead, Jesus said, sit down at the lowest seats. Way to go, you scum of the earth people. Sit down at the lowest seat so that he who invited you could say, friend, what are you doing there? Move up higher. And with great honor in the presence of everyone, and honor and shame were everything in those days. If I honored you, wow, you would walk over here slowly so everybody can see where you're going, and you take your place at a higher seat. Therefore, Jesus told his disciples, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. It was all about the shape and the rules of a table just like this. This is what the Last Supper looked like. There is internal evidence in the Bible. There is external evidence about the Bible. This is what the table looked like. Da Vinci knew nothing about it, or he probably would have painted it correctly. He did not do it. Now, knowing that the table is shaped like this, knowing that people reclined at the table in the manner in which you're seeing right here, and knowing that there is this pecking order around the table, we can learn from the Scriptures where 4 of the men sat at the Last Supper. Only 4, but that's enough for us, and especially for tonight. Let me show you how this worked. On the VIP wing of the table, second person from the end, right here, this is the position at any triclinium meal where the host would have reclined, right here. And at the Last Supper, definitely the host was Jesus. This is Jesus, right here. You say, no, he was here. That's Da Vinci. This is reality. Jesus would have been right here. Now, knowing he was here, the second person whose location we know is right here. Now, if Jesus were to straighten himself up at the table and sit, which you could do, you needed to do that to break bread and to do certain things at the table, so you wouldn't always sit like this, but this was the main way to do it. That this person right here would be to the host's right, or the right hand of the host, the right hand of glory, as it were, you might say. This person right here, who are they? They're the bodyguard. Bodyguard? They had a bodyguard at the Last Supper? Yes, they did. Let me demonstrate how this worked. I got to get down into my reclining position. I hope you can see me okay. So I'm reclining like these guys here. I'm this man right here. Now, you'll notice if I'm on my left arm and you're on your left arm, you can't see the rest of the table well, can you? It's hard to see. You've got a really good view of the table. You have a really bad view of the table, but you do have the best view of the door. There's nobody in front of you, and if somebody comes through that door to harm the host, and hosts were important people, and they had important enemies, and if they're feasting, remember, they could be there for days. If somebody were to burst through that door to want to harm the host, all this man, the bodyguard, has to do is fall back on the host, and he becomes a human shield. Unfortunately, if the person coming through the door wants to hurt the host, he's not coming through with empty hands. He's probably armed with a sword or a spear or something else, which is why the bodyguard traditionally always brought with him his own sword. This man brought a sword with him, and it would be sitting right out in front so he could grab it in case anybody wanted to hurt the host. Now, it was more ceremonial by those days, but it was a real sword. Now, you say, they didn't have swords at the Last Supper. Have you read Luke 22 recently? Yeah, look, Master, here are 2 swords, and we know there were at least 2. Peter had one, and this man had one, and there could have been other guys with swords. You say, why all the swords? Because they thought they were going to have a military overthrow of the Romans under the Messiah. And besides, guys like swords. So you have this fellow here with a sword, and it's sitting out in front of him, the bodyguard. But who is he? He tells us, if this man wants to speak to Jesus, who is behind him, what's he going to do? Roll around on the floor like an idiot? I mean, no, he's not going to do that. All he has to do is lean back, and he falls right in the middle of his chest. His head lands here. He tilts his head up. Jesus puts his head down. They have a conversation. This is the disciple who leaned on Jesus' chest. John, and he tells us twice in his gospel, that's where he was at the Last Supper. You say, that's a little awkward. It certainly is. I spend a lot of time in the Middle East, and I've got a lot of friends who are Arabs. And I found that especially the Arabs who have lived there for generations uncounted, if you talk to them as an American, if you want to talk to me, you're going to be about that far away, sort of a bent arm's length. You're here, I'm here, we talk, we have a great conversation. You go to Jerusalem, into even the Christian quarter, which, have you ever tried to picture people in the Christian quarter? They're all Arabs. They're Christian Arabs, most of them. Yeah, how do you picture these people? They're Christian Arabs. And you go and talk to them, and they're right here. And I back up, and they talk here. And I back up, and they keep moving up like they have to smell you in order to talk with you. But you see, in the Middle East, personal space is closed. I was marooned one time between planes at London Heathrow Airport during the Hajj. London is the hub for all the Muslims in the world coming in to go to Mecca. They go there, they catch a plane, they fly out. And you'll see men dressed even like I'm dressed today, walking around, two men holding hands, not because they're gay, because they're friends. Personal space is close, and that's just the way it is. This is John. This is Jesus. Now, if John was the disciple who leaned on Jesus' chest, on whose chest did Jesus lean? Oh, by the way, take into consideration something. If John is leaning on Jesus' chest to talk with him, there's another thing that you can do. You can hear his heart beating. If Jesus was here, which he was, he would lean on this man's chest, and he could hear his heart beating. This person here, you're the guest of honor, which means that Jesus personally chose these two people to be at his right hand and at his left hand here at the Last Supper, here at the Passover. Very, very honored seats. And the guest of honor, the most important person in this wing of the table other than the host. He's very, very important because Jesus, the host, would have said, "You are my guest of honor." He even got the first bite of food. That was how important he was, and that was a big deal in those days. And don't take it personally, but you're also Judas Iscariot. You say, now wait a minute. Guest of honor, Judas Iscariot. Guest of honor, Judas Iscariot. Didn't Jesus know what Judas was going to do a long time before? And that night, Jesus knew exactly what Judas was going to do. And Jesus still told Judas, he didn't sit there by accident. He told Judas, "You are my guest of honor. You sit here." Now, how do we know that Judas was there? Well, it's pretty obvious, and some of you are way ahead thinking right now, that in the Gospels, Jesus makes a startling announcement. He says, "One of you here tonight at this table is going to betray me." The disciples erupt in outrage. You can hear them shouting and yelling, "Who is it? Who is it?" Like they're going to take him out and beat him up or something. The others are maybe a little less secure. Is it me? I mean, is it me? Who could it be? Is it me? And finally, Peter, who is over here, is able to catch John's eye. That's how we know he was over, because John doesn't have a good view of the table. He's able to catch John's eye, give him a sharp nod, that's the gesture it talks about, and says to John, in the midst of all the shouting and outrage, remember, these are Middle Easterners, they're very outspoken, he manages to say to John, "Ask him who it is." Suspense was killing him. So John leans back on Jesus' chest and says, "Master, who is it?" Jesus said, apparently loudly enough for everyone to hear, because that seems to be what happens in the narrative. He said, "It's the one who breaks bread with me, who dips in the sop with me." And then Jesus would have straightened himself out to a seated position at the table. He would have picked up a piece of bread, like what you were eating tonight. He would have torn off a small bite-sized piece and dipped it into something in front of him. Now, at the Passover, by the time of Jesus, it wasn't just the Passover elements. You would have had elements like salt water and bitter herbs, and you would have had something called charoset. Charoset is the way it spells in English, but it's like a chutney made out of apples and dates and things. It's very delicious. And you would have had other things on the table, but chances are he would have dipped it into the charoset. And there would have been other food on the table too. Maybe he dipped in something else. They even had that night something called fish sauce. They would have typically had this at a first century Passover. It's very strange, but that's what they would have done. It wasn't part of the ceremony, it just happened to be there. But he dips it in the charoset, which is sweet. And the bread, even though it's unleavened, is still delicious. And he dips it into the charoset, reaches around to his left, and puts it into Judas's mouth, marking him as the betrayer. And right there, right then, at that moment, the disciples knew that Judas couldn't possibly be the betrayer. It's got to be somebody else. Well, he's playing games with us. Maybe he's trying to give us some sort of a spiritual teaching. We don't know what it is, but it certainly isn't Judas. When Jesus put the bread into Judas's mouth, he told Judas, go out and do what you got to do. John tells us that when the bread went into Judas's mouth, something else happened to him. Satan possessed him. No, not some demon, the devil himself. For how long, we don't know, but it happened at that moment. The other guys are oblivious to this. Judas gets up from the table and he leaves, presumably taking the money bag with him. And the disciples ask, where's he going? And some thought he was going out to do a good deed, to give money to the poor, perhaps buy more food for the feast. But not one of the disciples at this table questioned that Judas could possibly be the betrayer. For two reasons. Number one, he had the money bag. You don't give the money bag to some shifty-eyed, fanged, drooling thief. You give the money bag to the most trusted among you, which tells us, because Judas had the money bag, that of all the disciples, at least two of the disciples, Judas was the most trusted. But the other reason is far more interesting, because Judas, when Jesus put bread in his mouth, it wasn't the first time he did it. He did it earlier that evening. And the reason why is that when you start the meal, the host would pray. He would never take the first bite. He would pray over the bread. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who gives us bread from the earth, tears off a piece, and then would dip it into something and reach around to his left and give the very first bite of food to the guest of honor. Later in the evening, Jesus did it again to mark Judas as the betrayer. Here's why the disciples didn't get it. If you had bread in front of you right now, you don't. So when do you do this? Let me make a suggestion. Try this at communion the next time you take it. You tear off a piece of bread, and when you do this, you put it into somebody else's mouth, and you have sent them a nonverbal message. It still exists to this day, especially among the more deep desert Arabs. It's dying with modernization of the world, but the tradition is still there. That if I come up to you and put bread in your mouth, the message is this: you are my brother or sister, as it were, and I would gladly die for you. I love you. I do you honor. I highly esteem you. I am your friend. And in some cases, most conveniently, it also means I forgive you. All of that with this. To tear off a piece of bread, stick it in somebody else's mouth, is the greatest honor in that society that you could ever do to another person, except for physically dying for them. No wonder they didn't get Judas. But you could see what Jesus is doing. He's giving Judas every last opportunity. Look at the message he's sending Judas. Judas got the message. And the fact that he still went out to betray him after Jesus puts the bread in his mouth. Judas, you're my brother, and I'd gladly die for you. In fact, I'm going to do it tomorrow. Judas, I love you. Judas, I do you honor. Judas, I lift you up, I esteem you, not because of what you're doing, because it's what I do. A friend of mine once said, Jesus loves you not because you're good, because he's Jesus. That's what he's doing. And Judas, I forgive you. And the fact that he took that bread and then left, really in the Bible, if you were living back then and you heard this read to you, you would consider that perhaps the most outrageous moment in Scripture. Right there. That a man could still do what he did after Jesus put bread in his mouth. Jesus gave a message once, and this is great for pastors because you know what pastors do when they look at the watch. It means nothing to them. Jesus gave a message that was really the perfect three-point message. It's over in Luke chapter 6. It's like the Sermon on the Mount, but not in the same location. And he says to his disciples, you who hear me, you know what that means? Listen up. Are you listening? Pay attention. That's what it means. You who hear me, I say to you, and he says to his disciples, he says, love your enemies. In that world, you didn't do that. You tried to kill your enemies, disgrace your enemies, shame your enemies, but not love them. Well, how do you do that? Well, in the Bible, there's 4 words for love. Many of you know. You're taught by great Bible teachers here. You've got the word for family love, the way a mother loves a child, the way a brother loves a sister, storge. You have eros. We get the word erotic, physical love. You have phileo, or philos, if you want to call it that. That's love that is fondness, that's friendship, but fondness is a far better word, which is often confused with an extreme version of God's love, which is, see, you know, agape love. And we often look at agape as if it's a supercharged form of phileo, that God just, you're an awful person, but God helps me love you in spite of that. That's not the definition of that love. Because it doesn't really have anything to do with how you feel. Not that it can't be attached to that. That's not what it's about. Agape, love your enemy. Agape, your enemy, means do good to your enemy. Even while they're still your enemy. Even when you still don't like them. He says, you do good to them. What type of good? God's good. What does that look like? Very simply, here's his 3-point sermon. It's so fast, it's amazing, and it's so profound. He says, you ready? How do you love your enemy? Do good to those who hate you. Notice he never said feel good. That will come, hopefully. But while you're still on terms like an enemy, do good to your enemy. Do good to them. What kind of good? What kind of good did God do to you when you were his enemy? Do good to your enemy. Second one. Bless those who curse you. It's not just, oh, they're cussing me out, I'll say God bless you. It's not even that. Remember, we started with shalom aleichem. It's a blessing. Peace be upon you. That sort of blessing, where the blessing is not just saying, have a peaceful day, have a nice day. It means literally, I want for you the best that God could give you. It's up to him to give it or not. But I'd like you to have a long life and good health and a big family. And I'd like you to prosper. No, this isn't prosperity doctrine stuff. This is something that you personally would probably like to have for yourself. You're saying, I want that for others. I want that for the person I'm blessing. So he says, bless those. Do that to somebody who's cursing you. And cursing you isn't cussing. That's profanity. It's different. Cursing you is like a prayer asking God to smite you, to kill your children, to wipe out your family, to wipe out your wealth. It's asking God to do something horrible like that. He says, somebody's doing that to you, you bless them. Well, that's rewarding them for being bad. You leave that up to God. See what he does with it. The third one is pray for those who are harming you. So you've got some people who are doing you harm, whatever it might be. Maybe it's physically, maybe it's in the courts, maybe it's something else. They've got you painted into a corner. They've got you, as it were, chained to a wall and you can't get out. Then Jesus just says, pray for them. You read over in the book of Isaiah, you've got 2 different instances there where God says, I know where your enemy sleeps. I'll take care of him. You pray for them. You can't get to him. I can. And I will do what I want with them. So you pray for your enemy. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who are harming you. And what did Jesus do with Judas? He put bread in Judas's mouth. Judas, you're my brother, and I'd gladly die for you. In fact, I will. Judas, I love you. Judas, I do you honor, not for what you're doing. I just do you honor. Judas, I lift you up. I highly esteem you. There's nothing I wouldn't do for you. Judas, I'm your friend. You're not mine. Judas, I forgive you. Here's my question before we go to the last person. And then I have one more thing to share after that, and we're done. I hate this question. How do you honor your enemy? You're probably thinking, well, I really don't. Jesus did. To the very end, he honored his enemy. How do you honor your enemies? It was the whole point of that lesson in the evening. The last person whose location we know at this table actually takes the longest for me to describe. And that person is way over here. Peter. Now, please understand something. This is not just the scum of the earth wing of the table. This is the scum of the earth seat at the scum of the earth wing of the table. This is the worst seat in the house at any triclinium. Nobody wants to sit there. Peter's there, and you know Peter. Peter liked to be first, and he'd be the first one to tell you that he should be first. But he's not only last, he's dead last. What is he doing there? Well, Peter and John, who are opposite each other at the table, remember, if you read Luke 22, Jesus told them, go into Jerusalem in the morning and set up this meal, set up the Passover, and so they did. Maybe Peter was outside, and everybody comes into the room. Jesus says, John, you're here. Judas, you're here. Everybody else picks their favorite seats, but you know what seat's going to be empty. Nobody wants to sit there. Worst seat in the house. And so Peter walks into the room and looks around and, oh, come on, guys, I can't sit here. Somebody move, make space for me. No, Peter, sit down. I can't sit there. I'm Peter. I'm the rock. Remember, I walked on water. Yes, Peter, and you sank too. Sit down. So Peter goes and reclines at this miserable seat, but he's standing up on the inside. Now, perhaps he came into the room knowing everybody was not going to sit there. They were all going to sit elsewhere. And he comes into the room knowing that seat won't be taken, and he waits. And then finally, he goes over to the seat, and he happily reclines at the seat because Peter is humble. And I will recline at this horrible seat, and the master will look over at me, and he will say, oh, Peter, you're so humble. Move up higher. Judas, take a hike. Peter, come and be my guest of honor. But he never did it. In fact, in the Gospels, Jesus never even acknowledges that Peter is there, at least not initially. And Peter waits, and he waits, and he waits. And why isn't the master moving me? Can't he see how humble I am? And Jesus never even brings it up. And Peter languishes here, but he's standing up on the inside. The thing that I think happened, it's my opinion. If you don't agree, it's okay. But this is what I think for various reasons. I'll explain in a minute. Jesus told Peter to sit here. John, you're here. Judas, you're here. You notice Peter came with a sword. Remember? He cuts a guy's ear off in the garden. He had a sword. Maybe Peter wanted to sit here. Jesus says, Peter, you're here. Why? Master, I want to sit. No, Peter, you sit there. But Master, Peter, sit there. But sit. And he goes over to that terrible seat and he reclines. But why does the master hate me? Why did he tell me to sit there? And he's standing up on the inside again because I shouldn't be sitting here. Aren't I better than this? Now, two things. I've just told you that Peter resents being there, standing up on the inside. And I also told you that he's here. But how do we know either of those things? And the answer is quite simple. These objects right here, what are they used for? Washing feet. You know, it's what it looks like, right? A pitcher, a basin, a towel for washing people's feet. And frankly, if you were at a great feast and there were no foot-washing servants or slaves, these objects were conveniently left right here for that guy to wash everyone's feet before the meal began. And late into the evening, apparently, at least partway into the evening, everyone's feet are still, apparently, unwashed. Because I'm no foot washer. You want your feet washed? You guys do it yourself, but it isn't going to be me. What's the problem with a foot washer? Understand this. In that world, the filthiest part of the human body, to this day, in the Middle East and across huge swaths of Asia, the filthiest part of the human body is the bottom of your feet. We know where your feet have been. You've been walking where the animals have been. You've been walking in the dirt. You've been walking on worms or things. Just horrible. And you've also been walking, if you lived in a village or a city, where people have been. They would toss their chamber pots out into the streets. You say it must have smelled horrible. Yes, it did. If you've ever been to some of the more developing nations in the world and you walk into a village or a town, that's what you're hit with right away. So we know where you've been walking. The bottom of your feet is the filthiest part of the human body. More than that, it's so filthy that it's used as an insult. If I were to deliberately or even accidentally expose the bottom of my foot to you, you would be horribly insulted. In fact, if I did it on purpose, them's fighting words, folks. As a matter of fact, it could even mean, I wish you dead. You may remember that when George W. Bush was about to leave office, he went to Iraq to do a special surprise news conference there. And while he was up at the podium, some guy in the back who was an Iraqi Arab took his penny loafers off and threw them across the room at President Bush. He ducks, he laughs. Here comes another shoe. He ducks, he laughs. Some people turn around, they're smiling. Those were the Americans. The Iraqis, and they tackled the guy to the ground and dragged him out because the man was saying, if I could kill you, I would. And he threw his shoes at him. That's what the bottom of your foot is like. And to be a foot-washing servant or slave, to wash the bottom of somebody's feet, that makes you, in their minds, the lowest form of human life. There is nobody lower. There is no worse job anybody can do. If you're a foot washer, you're the worst there is. There's no human lower than you, no job worse than what you're doing. Have you got it? Peter doesn't consider himself a foot washer. There is one other thing that happened in John 13 where Jesus, talking about Judas, before Judas was revealed as the betrayer, he said this, the one who has eaten my bread has lifted up his heel against me. I wish you dead. That's what that meant. Judas was a really bad guy, and yet Jesus kept loving him. Back to Judas again, aren't we? Well, here's Peter. And Peter's no foot washer. And then John 13 tells us something. You read it on your own. It's a fabulous chapter, one of the greatest in the Bible. That Jesus then gets up from the table and shows his disciples the full extent of his love. All of it. This is what it looks like. It's a parable. It's a living parable. But this is what the sum total of his love for people, his disciples, for the world looks like. He gets up from the table. He would have come over here, even though this detail is not in the Bible. He strips himself down to his loincloth, which simply means he's gone to his underwear. He is now bare-chested. He takes a big towel and wraps it around his waist, which now becomes his clothing, and he's going to dry people's feet on his clothes. Are you getting the picture of how shameful that is? And yet, that's what a foot washer had to do, and this is what Jesus is doing. Well, he takes the pitcher, the basin, the towel, and he goes over to this side of the room, starting with John. And he would have washed John's feet. Look, they're not under the table, they're out by the wall, right where he could get to their feet. Very, very easy. So he washes John's feet. Now, we're going back in time a few minutes. He washed Judas's feet before Judas left. So he washed Judas's feet. And then he goes around the table washing each of his disciples' feet until the Bible says he finally came to Peter. And Peter has a very strong reaction. You remember what it is. You've read this. He says, are you going to wash my feet too? Jesus says to Peter, Peter, you don't realize what I'm doing right now. But later you'll understand. Now, those words don't exactly rot your socks off. They will in a minute. Those are highly significant words. Peter, you don't realize what I'm doing right now, but later you'll understand. And later he did. Well, then Peter has that classic reaction, no, Lord, you'll never wash my feet, because he's so humble. No, I don't think so. I think his reaction is horror, not humility. 6 months before this night, way up in the northern finger of Israel at a place called Caesarea Philippi, Jesus gathered his disciples together at this very pagan area, at the region, and he asked them a question. Get this question right, go to heaven. Get it wrong, go to hell. It's that serious. He asked his disciples, who do you say that I am? And who answers the question? Good old Peter. He steps forward, full of the Holy Spirit. Yes, that happened before Pentecost on occasion, and this was one of those times. He steps forward and he says, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God. You're God wrapped in human skin. You are the Messiah to save. That's what he's saying. You're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God. And if you didn't think Jesus ever smiled, you missed the next verse. It says he rejoiced and he said, oh, Peter, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood didn't tell you that. My Father just told you that. Way to go, Peter. And now, that man who was revealed to him as the Messiah, as God wrapped in human skin, as the Redeemer of the world, he is the Messiah, the chosen one, the anointed one. He wants to wash Peter's feet. No! That'll never happen. Why? Because it's all wrong. I know who you are. It should have been me, but Peter can't interrupt him now. He's shamed. He should have done it. The guys are probably looking at him as Jesus is going around washing everybody's feet. And of course, Peter can't do anything about it. They're looking at him like, yeah, look what you made him do. Never mind that they didn't do it either. And Peter has to sit there and listen to the Lord say, I got to wash your feet. No, you'll never do it. Then Jesus said to Peter, look, if I don't wash your feet, you can't have any part with me. Peter loved Jesus. Then give me a bath, wash all of me, wash my head, my hands, my feet, all of me. I almost think that Jesus had to calm Peter down a little bit. Peter, it's okay, it's all right. Just your feet. You're already clean because of what I've said to you. Just let me wash your feet. And Peter let him. And as Jesus knelt down behind Peter to wash his feet, as he did so, this moment right here, what you're looking at is the full extent of his love. Well, I thought it was all of it. Well, it is. But this is the climax of it. Because this is when Jesus, Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah, Lord of the universe, God wrapped in human skin, became the foot washer of a foot washer. Did you just hear what I said? Do you get it? Listen, there's no lower person in their society, in the world, in their minds, than a foot washer. And Jesus washes a foot washer's feet. The greatest in the universe goes below the lowest and lifts him up. He washes a foot washer's feet. And in the history of records, we don't have anyone ever talking about anywhere someone washing a foot washer's feet. They were at the bottom of the food chain. And Jesus did it right there in John 13. He washed a foot washer's feet. That's the full extent of his love. And you better believe that that was also definitely a parable for what he was to do tomorrow. Being executed on a cross, dying for your sins and the penalty for your sins. The worst execution that anybody ever experienced, because all the guilt of every human that ever lived, was living then, and ever will live, was heaped upon him. So that even the worst people on earth, if they simply said yes to Jesus, could go to heaven, their sins forgiven. He washed the world's feet from the cross, as it were. That's the full extent of his love. You're here tonight because of that. Because your feet were washed too. Some of you in this room may have never said, I need to let you do that. Tonight's the night. Now, Jesus, when he got finished washing Peter's feet, put his clothes back on, resumed his place at the table, and said to his disciples, do you know what it is that I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so. That's what I am. Now that I, your teacher and Lord, have washed your feet, so now you wash each other's feet. I don't like to hear that. And then he said this. He said, I have set an example for you. I don't know if you knew this, but it's the only place Jesus ever said those words. I've set an example for you. What? That you should do as I just did for you. What's that? Wash each other's feet. And then he said this, I tell you the truth. A servant, that's you, is not greater than his master. That's me. And the messenger, that's you, is not greater than the one who sent him. That's me. And now that you know these things, you will be, humiliated if you do them. No. Now that you know these things, you will be, inconvenienced if you do them. No. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed. Blessed if you do them. No foot washer was blessed. They were cursed. They were the lowest form of life on earth. No, you will be blessed if you do them. Do what? Wash each other's feet. Now, some churches have included this as a third ordinance like besides communion and baptism. And more power to you if that's what you do. I'm not here to berate that in any way. But I will tell you this, that how do you wash somebody's feet? I did this for a group of German Baptists who are my dear friends to this day, way up in Michigan, who had washed feet as a third ordinance for 150 years in their little community, and until they heard what you just heard, they said, we didn't know why. Now you know. Oh, and it gets better. How do you wash one another's feet? Well, you could have a foot washing service, as the pastors will tell you, any pastor from any church, and maybe you're from another church here too, that you can always have a foot washing service. But as a pastor knows, and any pastor knows, you can't ever announce it because everybody shows up with the cleanest feet you've ever seen, and it kind of becomes all ceremony and no meat at that point, right? I mean, what would you do? Foot washing service? I got to wash my feet before I go. Or, you may do it a little differently. Here's how you wash somebody's feet. Maybe you get your pitcher, your basin, your towel. You come here really early in the morning, Easter Sunday, next Sunday. You hide behind one of those bushes out there. First person that shows up to unlock the doors, you jump out from behind a bush, you throw them to the ground, dash the shoes from their feet, and start scrubbing away, because at least you have the chance of genuinely washing somebody's feet. It's ceremony. Or perhaps washing someone's feet is a little bit more. In fact, in a church this size, or perhaps your church, wherever you're from, before the service starts, and you know when they're going to start, come down to the front of the church, turn around and look at the last pews, the last seats, in the way in the back. You know who sits back there. Some people that like to talk, yeah, but usually people who kind of sneak into church, who don't want to be seen because maybe they're trying the place out. Maybe they don't smell so good. Maybe they're missing most of their teeth. Maybe they're homeless. Maybe they're something else. And you see that person, and you walk back there, and you sit right next to them, and you say to them, "How can I pray for you? I really want to pray for you. How can I pray for you today?" And then do it. Or perhaps finding a person like that. There are plenty in Auburn, and they're everywhere in the States, around the world. And finding a person that the Lord's leading and just say, "Can I buy you lunch? Can I make you a meal? I want to hear your story." You have just given that person more value than they probably experienced in decades. I want to hear about your life. Tell me your story. I'm listening. And you know what you've done? You've gone below those people and you've lifted them up higher than yourself, and you're going to keep them there. And it could be that or a billion other ways to do it. But you're going below others, those sitting next to you, those in the back of the room, those on the streets, and lifting them higher than yourself. That's how you wash somebody else's feet. It's why Jesus could wash Judas's feet, and why Jesus, in fact, did wash Peter's feet, a rebellious, angry foot washer who refused to do his job, and he still did it. Would you? Wash one another's feet. Now, one more thing, and I get to the end. One thing I got to tell you before we finish. I got to go back to Peter here. I told you that it is my personal theory that Jesus told Peter to sit here. Why? Because Peter wanted to sit here. Best seats in the house. So Jesus put him here. What, to punish him? No. To teach him a lesson? Definitely. But what was the lesson? Over in Mark chapter 9, you can look it up later. In Mark chapter 9, the disciples are going at it again. I'm the greatest, I'm the greatest. No, you're not, I'm the greatest. Jesus steps into the middle of this fray, and he said, if you want to be the greatest in my Father's kingdom, you learn to be the slave of everyone. We might say servant of all, that's softening it. It literally means slave of everyone. Now, you've got to remember, these people don't think like us. They didn't abstract well. They weren't stupid. It's just their form of logic back then. It's different than ours. When Jesus said, the slave of everyone, they didn't think like I, as a pastor, would think I could do 5 sermons off of that one phrase. They thought of only one thing. In every great household, be it Jewish or be it pagan, slaves or servants had rankings. At the top of the rank, whether it was a slave or a servant, was the household steward. Think Joseph in Potiphar's house after he worked his way to the top. He ran the household. And below them would be educators, perhaps for the pagans, a doctor, because you want a medical system, go buy a doctor's slave. Bring them into your home. Cooks, washerwomen, farmers, whatever. Just all the way down to the very bottom, and the very least, very last slave that you would get, of course, is who? The foot washer, who was also known as the slave of everyone. Jesus, early on in Mark 9, told his disciples, you want to be great in my Father's kingdom, you learn to be a foot washer. They heard it. They just didn't agree with it. He must be talking spiritually. He must be using some sort of a profound thing. Jesus didn't do that. He didn't leave us with riddles. What he said was a revelation, not a hiding. Not to confuse us, to show us. You want to be great in my Father's kingdom, you learn to be the slave of everyone, he said. Peter, you sit here. Why? Because, Peter, you think you're sitting in the worst seat in the house. I have news for you. This is the best seat in the house. He didn't learn the lesson that night. But this is the best seat in the house right here. And he didn't get it. He could have washed people's feet. Jesus was the most blessed person there. Wash one another's feet, you will be blessed if you do it. So Jesus was the most blessed man there that night. Peter missed the blessing. Jesus gave him the opportunity to do it. That's Jesus. Isn't that just like him? But instead he had to show them again. Best seat in the house. Not there. Here. Among your peers, in your church, here's a question. If it were characterized by this table with its pecking order, where do you sit? Here or here? Maybe a more important question to ask is, where do you want to sit? Here or here? Because Jesus said that's the best seat in the house, right there. The last thing I want to talk to you about is bread. I've already mentioned it, especially in the context of Judas over here. But this is Joe. And Joe and I have grown up together in the same village. Yeah, he hams it up too, doesn't he? It's all right, yeah. But Joe and I are neighbors. We're friends. We grew up in the same village. We work in the same trade. We've known each other all our lives, and then just last week, we got into it. Terrible quarrel. Knockdown, drag-out fight. He shamed me. I shamed him back. And now it's a cycle of vengeance like they have in the Middle East that's sort of answered with the term, it all started when he hit me back. And that's what we're doing from now on. We're just mad at each other. Our friendship is gone, but it shouldn't be that way. And finally, one of us comes to our senses. In this case, let it be me for a second. And you know, I don't want to do this because it's humiliating, but I come to Joe, and I'm angry with him, and he's angry with me. But I know it ought not to be this way. And I say, Joe, will you break bread with me? And if he agrees, he's agreed to reconcile. This is how they reconciled in those days, and even to this day in parts of the Middle East still, even with all the modernization going on. Okay, trick question. Answer it please out loud. How many pieces of bread do you see in my hand? Thank you. I pray. I break the bread because we're going to eat this. How many pieces of bread do you see in my hands? One. You say, that's crazy. No, it's not. Maybe some of you even experienced this morning. You were drinking your coffee. You set the mug down on the counter. You brushed it with your elbow. It falls on the floor and shatters into 1,000 pieces. How many coffee mugs are on the floor? One. One piece of bread. Got it? This is how they saw it. So I pray. I break the bread. I give half of the bread to Joe, and Joe takes that half of the bread, the half of the one piece, and he eats it. The bread goes into his body, and it becomes part of his body. It becomes part of him. I take the other half of the same piece of bread. I eat it. The bread goes into my body. It becomes part of my body. The same piece of bread that went into Joe and became part of him went into me and became part of me. The same piece of bread that went into me went into Joe and became part of him. What does that make us? Brothers. One is too abstract for their brains. That makes us brothers under the skin. And that means that whatever the quarrel was, it is now forgotten forever, to our shame, should we ever bring it back up again, because we have now reconciled, not by just becoming one, whatever that means, but becoming brothers under the skin. That's how it worked. Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, you may remember them, the prime minister of Egypt and the president of Egypt, who were mortal enemies. Sadat initiated a peace process that Jimmy Carter back in the 70s picked up on, and they signed something called the Camp David Accords, which is much like the Abraham Accords, where people are now in the Middle East like brothers. And you had a signing ceremony between Menachem Begin, who is the most right-wing leader of Israel ever, with his mortal enemy, Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, that he'd just been at war with 3 years before. And they signed a paper saying, we will not fight each other ever again. And then they get up from the table and they shake hands, and President Carter is shaking hands with them. And then the news was reported. They get nominated for Nobel Peace Prizes. It's wonderful, but everybody in the West missed the best part. This last December, I was there in Beersheba in Israel. There's an ancient well there that's about 100 feet deep that Abraham apparently dug, and they call it Abraham's well. Sadat, who was an Arab, and Begin, who was a Jew, have a common ancestor. His name was Abraham. He had dug that well, and well is water, and water is life. And they stood over the mouth of that well, and they both took a piece of bread and broke it and ate. And even though those two men have died, there is still peace between Egypt and Israel to this day. When you break bread, it makes you brothers. Israel and Egypt are now cousins under the skin in their minds. That's how it works. Next Sunday, this Sunday, is Resurrection Day. We talk about what happened the morning of the resurrection, how the women came to the tomb, and all of these things happen. Jesus meets them and speaks to them, and they do all kinds of things. Where were the men? You find out later on that with a couple of exceptions, the men were locked up in a room in Jerusalem because they were afraid that they're going to be on crosses next, because the rumor is being spread by people that were paid to spread it, that the disciples stole a body. It wasn't true, but the rumor was out, which means they broke Roman seals on the stone of the tomb, which means there's a death penalty that comes with it, and now people are searching for them. They're locked up in this room in Jerusalem, and they're terrified. Suddenly Jesus, the resurrected Jesus in his resurrection body, miraculously, he shows up in the middle of the room. He says to them, "Shalom Aleichem." They said nothing. They were terrified. And then the next words out of his mouth were, "Have you got anything to eat?" Why would he say that? Was he hungry? No. But please remember that everybody in that room, Judas is dead, Thomas is not there for some reason. Everyone in that room, a few nights before, listen, every one of them deserted Jesus. Deserted him. Some, not just Thomas, the Bible tells us in two places, some doubted him. One of them in that room denied him 3 times and once to his face. What did Jesus ask for? Have you got anything to eat? Let's eat. A week later, they're still locked in the room. He shows up. Shalom Aleichem. Next words out of his mouth. Have you got any food? And they gave him food, and he ate with them. They deserted him. They doubted him. Denied him. He ate with them. And following an angel's instructions, the guys finally left that room and went back up to Galilee while Jesus was still here on the earth resurrected. And when they got up to Galilee, they were told, "The Lord will meet you there," and he was nowhere to be found. And so Peter says, "I'm going fishing." Now that doesn't mean I'm going to occupy some time until we find the Lord. It means I quit. I'm done. I'm going back to my old job. Anybody who wants to come with me, come with me. 6 of the disciples went with them. They went out and fished all night long, didn't even catch a guppy. Jesus shows up in the morning in the dusk, and he's standing there on the shore, and he shouts as if he's a customer, "Have you caught any fish?" "Oh, great." "No." He said, "Throw your nets out the right side of the boat," and they do. And as they bring in the nets, Peter and John can't bring the nets in the boat. There are too many fish. 153 large fish, not including the bottom feeders they had to throw back. They couldn't get the net in the boat. It's the biggest catch of fish these guys have ever seen. John suddenly figures it out. He looks over at the fish. He looks at Peter. He looks at the man on the shore, and he says, "Peter, this reminds me of Luke chapter 5. Peter, that's the Lord." And Peter knows it. He jumps into the water. He wades the short 100 yards to shore. He comes out dripping wet, and he sits down next to a fire where Jesus is making bread. All you need is oil, water, flour, salt, a hot rock, a charcoal fire, and you can do this. And he's got it going. And he's got a stack of bread going right there. The disciples pull the boat up on the shore. Peter goes and gets them and brings them back. And there, these guys who had quit on him, who had deserted him weeks before, who had doubted him, one denied him and was still despondent, Jesus reconciles them in John chapter 21 to himself over a meal of fish and bread. And they never left him again. To their dying days, they never left him again. Reconciled to Jesus by bread. The worst church in the Bible was a church called Laodicea. And even though Jesus told the Laodiceans, you're lukewarm and you make me sick, I want to vomit you out of my mouth, he said, yet I stand at the door and I knock. And if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and I will do what? I'll eat with him. The worst church in the world, I'll still eat with you. Just let me in and let's do it. And tonight, many of you know you did that. But some of you are probably thinking, look, I'm a Christian, but I am doing things right now that are so bad I don't think God will ever take me back. And yet, I want you to listen to the words of the Apostle Paul because the entire evening pivots on this one point. Where the Apostle Paul, over in Romans 5:10, he said, listen, for if, when we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? What life is that? John 6, Jesus, I'm the bread of life. Your fathers ate manna in the wilderness. They died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven that one may eat of it and not die. I'm the living bread that comes down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever, and the bread that I shall give, that's my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. I am the bread of life. Reconciliation to my Father. I want you to pretend that my hand, if you would, is the hand of God the Father in heaven. God takes Jesus, the bread of life, as he called himself and is called, the miraculous manna from heaven. And God hands him down to sinful man. And he says, will you take my Son, this bread of life? Will you take him into yourself? Because if you do, you and I will be reconciled. On the night he was betrayed, Jesus took bread and he broke it. And he said, this bread means my body, which is for you. This makes memories. Never forget what you see here. And God hands the broken bread of Jesus down to sinful man. And he says, will you take my Son? Take him into yourself. And if you do, the quarrel that I have against you for your sin, I will personally forget for all eternity. You and I are now kin. We're related through Jesus. I hope you never look at communion the same way again. There's a lot more going on in there that these guys saw very plainly that night. So, if you think you've done something so wrong that God will never take you back, all night you've been hearing, oh yes he will. Oh yes he will. Oh yes he will. Not because you're good, because he's Jesus. He reconciles enemies to himself. And the last thing, if you've had a quarrel with somebody else, maybe in this room, just a suggestion. Make them a meal. Take them out to lunch. Take some bread. Any bread. Wonder bread. I don't care. Take it out and break it and say, will you eat this with me? You say, well, that's ridiculous. They weren't here. They wouldn't know what it means. It doesn't matter. As Jesus called his disciples, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children, literally, relatives of God. And in the words of an ancient rabbi, it takes two to reconcile, but it only takes one to forgive. Would you all stand, please? I'm not sure if somebody's coming up. Is somebody coming up? Well, while we're waiting for somebody to come up here, or I'll just dismiss you, I'd like to leave you with a blessing. Remember, a blessing is not something I can do. It's something only God can do. And it goes like this. Yiva rechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. Ya'er Adonai panav alecha v'yechu necha, yaseh Adonai panav alecha v'yasim lecha shalom. May the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he lift up his countenance upon you and give you shalom. Shalom Aleichem, everyone. Yeah, close enough. God bless you, and thank you for coming tonight. All right.
Well, we just want to thank you guys for coming out tonight. Man, what an awesome way to jump into Holy Week and really get brought into the story, be reminded of all that this really meant. I'd love to invite you guys to come back Friday night because we're going to do something very similar. We're going to come back together and we're going to continue to get in the Word of God and to remind ourselves of what Jesus did this final week. But you guys have a great night. My hope is that you would leave here looking at Scripture differently. You'd appreciate what the Lord did for you in a new way tonight, and that he would be glorified. Amen? Amen. Have a great night.